my novel Wild Abandoned set in a commune in Swansea in South Wales. And two of the main characters are brother and sister, but also there are a few other leading characters. And I'm going to read a section about Patrick, who was one of the founding members of the commune. He's in his late 50s. He's been living there for 20 years, and he's slowly been becoming more disaffected, more stoned and more paranoid over the years. At the point we meet him, he's just about to have a kind of psychotic break and start believing that the members of the community are out to kill him. I should just mention that he's a great rival. His great rival in the community, the kind of alpha male who he despises, is a character called Don, and that he's also in love with Janet. Patrick was standing in the middle of the geodesic dome in shapeless boxer shorts, holding a table leg with both hands in a baseball stance. He listened to the ash tree outside, groaning like a man slowly dying. He heard the distant sound of laughter that might well have come after a vicious but finely judged joke regarding his personal odour. He heard an unknown dog barking with a hoarse mindlessness, starved and bloodthirsty. Listening to the noises, Patrick constructed a narrative. He guessed that Albert, who was good at climbing, was in the ash tree above the geodesic dome, with his hands on a high branch and his feet on a lower one, stretching and bending his legs, making the tree creak loudly, knowing the fearful sleeplessness this would bestow. Marina had brought out her keyboard, he thought, with the surround sound speakers and set them up in a circle around the dome. With total disregard for electricity consumption, she was working fearful wind with one hand, and with the other, laughter at your expense and occasionally growling dog in bloodlust. This was all in aid of getting Patrick into a state of terrified paralysis, so that when they came into his room, chanting his name and wearing robes with deep hoods, come to take him at last, he would stay still, shaking in his bed, and, given his family history, suffer a fatal embolism. They would dispose of his body in the compost, and he would be replaced, for there were tens and tens of people who'd take his position, and they were younger and supple and spoke more than one language. His only option was action. He would have to duck through the low double doors, step out of the porch and into the moonlight, swinging his blunt implement. Breathing hard through his mouth, Patrick kicked out the double doors. As he stepped outside into moonlight, the cold landed the first punch, smacking him in the nose. He couldn't see the keyboard. He couldn't see the hooded figures. There was a bonfire smell. As he stepped along the slate path that led towards the yard, the cold ran up through his feet, his ankles, rattled past his knees and settled in his stomach. He looked back at the dome, checked the roof. Nothing there. He looked up into the bare ash tree. It creaked of its own accord. But then, at last, there was laughter. Keeping close to the south wall of the big house, he stayed out of the patches of moonlight. He was shivering. As he walked down the stepped wood-chipped path, he saw there were some people around a small fire at the bottom of the garden, which was not unusual for a Friday night. His mind swiftly reordered the previously stated narrative to make sense of the new information. They would tell him he was paranoid. They would put a flammable blanket around him. They would ask him whether he should consider laying off the bang lassies. Then they would tip him on the fire and beat him, burn him, dance and raise a glass to his great sacrifice, and by morning his bones would be nothing more than ash sprinkled over the beetroot patch and returned to the earth. Who will come looking for me? Nobody. They will keep signing for your pension so that even after your death you will still fund the community. It was Janet, Freya and Kate sat on 3 kitchen chairs around the fire, with Freya in the middle and one big blanket around all their shoulders, each with a mug. They were leaning into each other. There was a bladder of wine at their feet. He could hear them as he got close. "You haven't met him because he's a doofus," Kate said. "You call your boyfriend a doofus?" Janet said. She had her hair tied back, but a sweep of fringe across her forehead. "You wouldn't like him," Kate said. "I would," Freya said. "I'm into doofuses. Is he ugly? I like ugly men." Janet picked up the foil bag and, squeezing one end, topped up their mugs. Her face was puffy. She had 2 red wine stains, shaped like devil horns, at the corners of her mouth. Well, he's not ugly, Kate said. I knew it. He's beautiful, Janet said. You have to let us meet him. Patrick. He was standing on the other side of the fire, the table leg down at his side, and he was shivering so fast he could have turned to gas. In the firelight, they saw the skin on his shoulders, sun-aged and slack. His chest hair was not at all dense, but it was evenly spaced. Come on then, he said. I'm ready. Pat, what's happened? Freya said. You must be freezing. They stood up together, the blanket falling from their shoulders. I suppose you're the lure, the sirens, he said. Tell us what's wrong, Janet said. You're shivering. Yeah, that's it. Offer to warm me up. You won't get near me. Kate spoke slowly. What are you talking about? He shouted into the woods. Come out! His giant lungs flapping. Come out, I'm ready for you. There was the noise of disgruntled birds. Sweetheart, let me put this round you, Janet said, coming towards him with the blanket held up, matador style. Patrick raised the table leg. I'm not going to hurt you, Patrick. I'm Janet. You know me. We're friends. I know perfectly well who you are, you patronising cow. I should have known all along. Kate came round the other side of the fire, followed by Freya. Put down the table leg. Pat, what happened? Should I call an ambulance? That's it. Pack me off, he said. Janet took a step closer and raised the blanket up. Her eyes were red. They were closing in on both sides, and then, dropping the table leg, he turned for the fire, ran towards it, his shivering body, his loose skin purple in patches, and he leapt over the heat, the knee-high flames, his feet passing through them. He landed on the other side with a grunt and was away running. They watched him disappear, brief seams of flame in the pale hairs on the backs of his calves, like lit brandy on a Christmas cake, the skinny legs clattering off into the woods. Everyone was awake, standing round the last of the fire at the bottom of the garden. They were pale-faced, interrupted dreams just beginning to fade. Don, in an act of deliberate melodrama, was out there in his blue casual kimono, which he wore around the house instead of a dressing gown, over pyjamas as well as a woolen hat and walking boots. He thought of himself as useful in an emergency. They passed the table leg from person to person, each trying to gauge Patrick's mindset by moving their hand along its corniced midsection. The moon was bright, and if there was a night for finding a pale, pot-bellied man running through undergrowth, this was it. Don pulled his kimono tight. This was a rare chance for a display of leaderly navigation. With the air of a sergeant letting his squadron know that they would not all come back alive, he said, and I'm turning the mobile phones on. A torch for each group. They moved away from the fire, clutching their faces as the cold hit. Making their way into the dark, they were able to mark Don and Freya's progress by the distant sound of months of text messages and voicemail finally coming home. This was the phone's first genuine emergency, the needlessly loud message received tone that nobody had ever learned how to change, like some strange bird call echoed back and forth through the woods. When light started to seep in above the horizon, so the edges softened on Patrick's paranoia. He was clinging to the branch of a low oak tree, his feet wedged in a Y-shaped split in the trunk. The one thing he was absolutely certain of, that his friends were out to kill him, was becoming unconvincing. The difficulty was he didn't want to be wrong. What if there was no fundamental problem, and he should just be a bit more outward-looking, and cut down on the weed a bit, and try to help other people and practice a few new recipes, and that would be enough. He prayed to any god that this was not the solution, that moderation was not what he needed, that these people really were coming to shake him down, to tell him some home truths, that they came with a bolt gun and a panel saw. In the cold, his body was shrinking. He had no toes. They had disappeared an hour ago. He had no feet. He had no hands, no nose. His ears were missing. His eyes made insectile clicks each time he blinked. They would freeze over if he gave them a chance. Even if he had wanted to call the names of the people he cared about, the cold would not let him pronounce them. He heard voices coming from different sides. He had no wrists, no elbows. And although he now knew, deep down, that they were not out to kill him, he would do anything to delay their sympathy, their thoughtfulness, their forgiving. He let himself fall from the tree he had climbed. There was a dry, cracking sound. Everyone heard it. He had no ankle to shatter. Dragging himself onwards, he stumbled, making small animal noises with splinters of bone beneath his skin, while 3 parties closed in and Janet yelled, "Patrick, we're coming!" At the edge of the forest, where the National Trust boundary ended, there was a new homes development, a single cul-de-sac built on the edge of Llanmaddock with views of the woods beyond. It had just been completed and no one had moved in yet. Patrick crawled into the street. The windows were blank, no curtains, no trinkets, no cars in the drives. He flopped on the even concrete. His body shook. The street light was steady. He was the same colour as the moon. It was Janet who first spotted him and started running down the street, followed by Kate and not far behind, Don, Albert and the rest. A cloud of them, steam coming off their scalps. Patrick was curled up, but with his left leg stuck out in an attempt to keep it numb. The ankle had ballooned, the shape of his foot lost to the swelling. He made the low gurgling noise of a radiator filling. Janet unbuttoned her coat as she ran, and behind her the others followed suit. His thin boxer shorts were torn and stained, a purple testicle like a limpet against his thigh. They took off their clothes as they descended on him, just as he had feared, and smothered him in coats and jumpers, laying out everything they could and swaddling him until it was just his head at one end and at the other his broken ankle, a geodesic dome, the skin dying, turning grey at the edges. While Janet efficiently tucked the clothes in around him, Don made a display of knowledge. "The predator here is the cold," he said. "Patrick is at risk of going hypothermic. He's stopped shivering. That's not good. It won't be enough to simply cover him in coats. He needs body contact. Patrick, I'm going to give you a hug." Thanks very much.